Welcome back, everybody, to Business and Life Stories with James and Mike. Our guest this week is Laura Livingston. And man, are you guys and girls in for a big treat. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
So you're a world changer that sort of changes the world by changing the way other people change the world. So you do you have this pivot chats thing, and you have coaching for some pretty high-powered people that kind of need to rein it in a bit. So what in the world got you into that business?
That is a really good question. I think the short answer is it has just evolved into this over time. I actually said to somebody this morning, when I was a kid, I was very jealous of all, and I mean kid, like all the way through college. I was very jealous of all the people who just knew what they wanted to do and knew what their special talent gift was. And I was just kind of like, okay, must be nice. I can do some stuff and I have things that I'm interested in, but I had no earthly idea what I wanted to do with my career. And then 18 years in corporate, I still didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I just sort of figured it out as I went. And then 5 years now as an entrepreneur, the same thing has happened. I was never somebody that just knew instantly what I wanted to do in the world. So I just sort of created it. And then it turns out like there's coaches out there, and I didn't even, coaching wasn't a thing when I was a kid. And I'm like, oh, I guess I'm a coach. I've been doing this my whole life. I just didn't know what to call it. And so it has been, the short answer is it's been quite the evolution and experiment, honestly, of piecing together what's most interesting to me and how I want to work with people. But yeah, I started in corporate in change management and got a master's in organization development. And I've always been really interested in psychology. And organization development is basically taking psychology and all the applied behavioral sciences, but applying them to organizations. So whether that's looking at how societies change over time, or how organizations change over time, or even just how groups and small teams change over time and work together or don't work together in many cases to thrive or bring out the best in everybody. And so that's really what I studied. And then I've just sort of, in essence, in hindsight, I've sort of taken that and applied it in lots of different places. So lots of consulting, a little bit of freelance consulting work, and a little bit of HR in corporate. And then 5 years now as a coach, mindset coach and business coach for small businesses.
What are some common things you see with your clients as far as what do they need for mindset training? There must be some commonality that pops up, right? Or some more frequent things. So what are some of the problems or things business owners aren't doing that they should be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times, at least for the people, I work only with people who love what they do and really are kind of in their zone of genius, which, has an evolution of itself, I think over time. But I would say most of my clients, myself included, are multi-passionate, and they have all these big ideas and big dreams. And while they typically have come to me in a period in time where they've already done a lot of big stuff, whatever you want to call big, no judgment, big or small, but whatever feels important to them to create or the work that they're doing in the world. And okay, now I need to do especially now it's January when we're recording this, right? And they're like, well, Laura, I'm going to do these 17 things this year. And I'm like, that's awesome. What's the most important? Or the two most important if we have to pick. And that's really hard for me too. But I think helping them make decisions and think through what they want to do and where they want to go, in many cases is a big, big, big part of my day, big part of my job.
Well, I've certainly suffered from that, and it's a good thing I have James around to sort of rein me in and say, Mike, which of these 12 things are you going to do today?
Right.
It is helpful. So I'm glad to know I'm not alone in this kind of seeing all the things at once.
I think entrepreneurship attracts us, I think the reason entrepreneurship is so attractive to many people is because it sort of has no limits. You can create, you can do multiple businesses at a time, and you can do all these things and innovate. And I think it attracts, that kind of a brain. And we can get in our own way, and that's just one example. But I think allowing ourselves to choose is important to get traction on something.
And have you noticed that this is a problem that no matter how big or small the company is, or is it more of a problem in a smaller company?
I was going to say yes, but I actually want to think about that for a second. I feel like on the one hand, I could say people who've only been in business for a few years. I don't typically work with brand new business owners, but they've got, some foundation, but that can happen very quickly for some people. I think in some ways I could say I've seen newer business owners really struggle with it in some ways, because I think they think maybe what they're doing, it's not quite working, or it's not working as fast as I wanted to. So maybe I should do something else. But I find that the bigger a person's, because I coach one person, right? I coach the business owner. So the bigger their success is to them in the way that they perceive success to be, the more they have different mindset things, or some of the same old mindset things that, that they dealt with 3 years ago that are coming back up because they've hit a new level of success, and that same thing pops up with confidence or whatever it is. But I think sometimes it's, well, now I have to do even more. So I'm not really answering your question. I think it's both. I could argue in both directions, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
James has that look that tells me he has a really good question for you.
I think, change is a fascinating thing, isn't it? The essence of change. From my very basic understanding, I would say the human mind, the human psyche, has a kind of an inherent resistance to change. Right. From my understanding, I guess it comes from when we used to hang out in caves, and we only went and fought and killed saber-toothed tigers when we were really hungry, because it was life or death. And if we stayed in our cave, then we didn't interact with tribes, and we didn't fall off a cliff or go into a raging river. So it was about tribe survival. So for me, there's so much to unpack around the concept of change and pivoting. I guess change is inherently painful. Is change painful for organizations, or as painful for organizations as it often is for individuals? I think that's an interesting question. From your experience within corporate, then moving into kind of one-to-one with CEOs and whatnot, is change painful across the board, or is it particularly painful for individuals, or is it just a painful experience? And does it have to be painful?
I love that question. I don't think it has to be painful all the time. I definitely have experienced in my life, in my work, and I've seen my clients experience moments of, oh, I can just stop doing that. That feels really good. A lot of times change, when you just realize you're just forcing yourself to do something you don't want to do. As a tiny example, I think sometimes change, we're not aware of the resistance, or maybe the resistance played out before we were even aware there was a change, and then we just made the change and, we felt better. And I think in many cases, even quote unquote good change can be hard. And so maybe, to use your word, pain might be too strong in certain cases, but One of my favorite authors on change is William Bridges, and I think he's actually passed away by now. He's wrote this book called Transitions years ago, and he basically talks about even if what you're creating is a change that you want, there is still a process that you have to go through. Like, okay, you decide to get married, for example. There's still a process that you have to go through to sort of, if you're aware of it or not, like to say goodbye to your single life and the advantages of like kind of just doing whatever you want to do, right? And whatever that looks like for your relationship. But even if something is what you're choosing and this feels great, there's still an ending. And so his model is it starts with the end. The middle phase is the transition, or he calls it the neutral zone, I think. And that's the like confusion, messy middle. Sometimes that's really short, right? And then the beginning is actually the final phase of the change. And it's not linear and it's, you know, messy, but I love that concept because it just sort of simplifies everything down to like, yep, I'm going through, you know, sometimes my clients don't even know they're going through a change. And when we just look at it really simply, it's like, oh, I'm going through a change. I'm not giving myself credit for going through a change. No wonder it's hard, right? I can just at least put myself in that model or put this situation in perspective. So, but I do think change is at some level, we have to deal with resistance, even if it's, you know, something quick, if it's something quick.
I think,
or excuse me, if it's something important. That's what I really meant. If it's something important, I think we're going to deal with it.
It's interesting, this concept of kind of a middle-aged crisis, right, where it's that cliche of the wealthy kind of man who maybe separates, goes out with a younger lady or man maybe, and buys a Harley or buys a Ferrari, maybe falls out with family members and either enjoys their life or lives to regret it. Either way, but when one starts to unpack that, and I went through a change, like a substantial change sort of in my 40s. So I was really fascinated and kind of looked into that and tried to unpack it a little bit. And what I found really fascinating, and I'd love to hear your view on this, is that change kind of comes along at certain points. Maybe in our 20s, it's sort of it's leaving home, it's sort of exploring bit academia through university, exploring kind of corporate. Perhaps often in the late 20s and 30s, it's from being like a single into a kind of a relationship, a permanent, a pair, and then often it would be maybe having children in the 30s, and then, but it was interesting because it was almost like without change we can never reach our next level. It's like if we stayed in academia all our life, and I'm not dismissing academics here or professors, but one might say that the longer we live, the more change opportunities or situations come along. And I read this fascinating comment once that back in the day when maybe the average lifespan was sort of 30, 35, we kind of reached a certain level there, but we actually, by living to 60 or 55, we then went through it gave us another opportunity. Stage changes came along, or we reached another level. And then maybe if we are like Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, and we live into our 90s and beyond, the more changes that happen in this cyclical, and some would say along with Steiner, the 7-year cycle, we actually, whether or not we want it or whether we see them, by going through them, we actually reach our next level. And if we don't live that long, so to speak, or back in past generations, they weren't able to attain that higher level of maybe awareness. Have you seen that in some of your clients with differing ages, where whether or not they expected it or even liked it or wanted it, the levels attained, it was like, wow, that was like amazing. You know, really successful XYZ in their 40s or 50s, and then this change comes along. You thought, that is unbelievable. Like I coached them through it, and now they have just reached this new level. Have you seen that? And what are your thoughts around that? Because that concept has kind of been in my head and fascinated me for almost a decade now. So
yeah, I yes is my answer. Yes, I have. I think you're 100% right. That's absolutely the way that I see it. I think, you know, what there's a couple of ways that I want to sort of respond to what you're saying. There's one, which is like, which I haven't actually thought about very much, but you're talking about, like, you know, from like even looking back at like caveman days versus people were living to their 50s and now they're living longer. And the word that comes to mind is what Abraham Maslow calls self-actualization, which is just this, like, you're up level, whatever, you know, to use your word.
Yeah.
And I think when we were a caveman, we didn't have that opportunity, right? It was like, you know, eat or be eaten. And I think even thinking about like my grandparents' generation, you know, my grandmother had three options. One, have babies. Two, be a secretary. Three, be a teacher. That was it. And that's just 2 generations. And so, you know, she just picked what was like logistically made sense for her, right? Not like, oh, what work do I want to do in the world? Like, this is I don't know, a privileged topic maybe. But I think then getting back to change, yeah, I mean, I for sure have seen just in my life how, especially the change that we could argue that change happens to you. That's a whole philosophical conversation separately. But, you know, I do think that it's easy to think about. It's easy if you sort of just simplify change into one of 2 different kinds. One is like change happens to you, right? So when COVID happened and businesses had to adjust, that wasn't something people were like going after and trying to create, right? But then sort of if you're feeling what I call a creative pivot in your work and you're like, yeah, this is what I've been doing. And it's just like, to get to that next level of my genius, of my creativity, of this work, I've got to keep growing the work, right? And I think the mindset and the personal growth that goes underneath that sort of follows that same trajectory. And the truth is, James, yes, I work with people who are entrepreneurs, and yes, I work with people in business, and this isn't to discount that, but if I had to pick like the psychology element of my work and the business element of my work, I would pick the psych every single time. That's really sort of, I just like to work I'd like to use psychology in this context because I think it's rife with opportunity to grow as a person. To your point, I think we absolutely, so many people that I work with, you know, they can't get their work to the next level until they do some deep personal work on themselves to maybe be visible with it the next level, or whatever it is that's in your way. So yeah, that's secretly like the person you know, change is hard, and I'm not saying that change is always the answer. There's a time for normalcy too, but I geek out about change, and part of that reason is because I just think when we sort of allow ourselves, I think it's sort of more just following that creative process of life and business. When we allow ourselves to go with that, we're going to grow as individuals. And I really think the psychology and the mindset behind those processes and those experiences are important and fascinating. And so, yeah, that's actually probably the part that I could geek out about the longest.
Yeah. I was speaking to this.
Really interesting. So
it is fascinating. I was speaking to this gentleman who has spent a long time in corporate of a big multinational, and then but he's also, it was fascinating really. He studied a lot of spiritual kind of philosophy. And it'll make me sound like I'm obsessed with kind of pain and like, but I think change. I mean, I think a lot. Maybe people don't want to dive in there, and I'm one of these people who does a bit of skiing and it does a bit of mountain biking, and things invariably go wrong when one hesitates, and often you just have to drop in and sort of go for it.
Yep.
And so this is why I'm sort of dropping in here. But he was also explaining to me that change is like a death, and there's actually grief involved within change. And in some ways that kind of goes back to what you mentioned just about a few minutes ago about moving from maybe a single status to a marital status. There is that death of maybe your first 20 years or no, the death of maybe your independence from possibly 16 or 17 up to 25, say, and then which is a lot. Everyone thinks of death as grief, as maybe sort of death of parents perhaps, and that significant change there, but have you come across this sense of grief with your clients of within the change concept rather than that change almost being kind of having to, because I believe that I've forgotten the author now, there was an author who wrote about the 7 stages of grief, I think. So yeah, hey, this is my final question really, but I would love to explore that because I think it's something that we all come across, and maybe it's something to really, it's so easy to brush under the carpet or not really speak about, and there is so much I know with the tragic passing of Lisa Marie Presley. She was involved, from my understanding, with setting up grief groups, and she actually said, and I read a couple of articles, that it's never spoken about. So here we go. I thought I would keep it topical, and yeah, would love your thoughts about grief within the change process, as it is a form of death, but also a form of rebirth after that.
100%. And you know, talking about sort of back to your question a couple questions ago, maybe about resistance and sort of how that shows up, because I think you're right. Like, we are wired to like stay safe. So however our brain decides is safe, that's how we're wired. And I feel like sometimes part of my job is to sort of like see what my clients aren't aware of, or like sort of what's underneath that little rug there, or what's underneath that statement. And sometimes what I'm looking for, honestly, is grief, or almost again, it's not linear, but almost like when we skip a stage and we just run at something. And I have done many life and business run at some things, and that in many ways has been the right thing for me. But it doesn't matter. Like when I moved here 3 years ago, I sort of made the decision within 6 weeks and up and moved out of the country. I kind of had to say goodbye to San Francisco after I got here, you know? And so whether it's moving jobs or locations, or I have clients too who move from like solopreneurship to having a small team. And as wonderful as that is to be able to move into that space, there's sort of also this like, why are we back to marriage? Like it was just, sometimes it was just easier to freaking do it myself and, you know, not have to deal with somebody else. And so absolutely the grief is there. Or if we're running so fast at something, sometimes one of the things I'll do with my clients, and, you know, sometimes it's just about sitting down and just thinking and letting the feelings come out and say, oh, you know what? I am sad. You know, this happens too a lot of times when a long-term client wraps up. That's not a bad thing. You know, we're not necessarily meant to serve everybody forever. And those long-term client relationships, it's like, wow, look what I had in my business then, and look what I have now. And this person was, or this organization was a part of it. So yeah, making space for that, reminding people that it's okay. And I think sometimes, honestly, like as however this may sound, having some sort of ritual for yourself when your business shifts, or even your work with a client shifts, whatever it is that you do, having some sort of moment, like when I wrap up work with a client, I always take a few minutes at the end of the final session to acknowledge the growth and what we've done together and to say what it meant to me. And so I think it is important. The endings are important. And when we forget about them or we rush past them, sometimes that's where the resistance will pop up and make it harder to sort of embrace that new birth beginning piece of it. Because it usually does all happen at once, right? It's not linear, usually, you know.
Never. Time is just an excuse for why everything doesn't happen all at once.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to probe a little bit more into this grief thing. This is really fascinating. What are some ways that a business owner can recognize if they're carrying grief in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Does it show up in a recurring thought that's kind of always there in the background, or does it show up in other ways?
I see it kind of showing up in different ways for different people. But because some people, like I said, like some people will be like, okay, I'm done with this. I just want to burn it down. Let's go do this next thing. Right. And so I know, like, that's my sort of clue. Okay, hold on, we're going to probably need to come back to this. It's cool. Let's run. But we're going to also, just so you know, we're coming back to it. Right. And then some people are in the reverse, right? They're sort of so in the grief. They're so aware of the grief that they can't move forward. I saw a lot of that with COVID, you know, like the quote death or the temporary death of work you love and not being able to do it is existential. It's you know, I think a lot of people got stuck in that space too. So I see it playing out in so many ways. But I think, James, to just go back to that point of resistance, a lot of times it's sort of, the brain is really sneaky, right? Because we're wired for that caveman, keep yourself safe. Again, whatever safe means to you. I really love change. I've moved a lot. I've traveled a lot. I've had a lot of different jobs. I've never been married. I'm in my 40s. I've had a lot of different relationships. And sometimes for me, change would be like staying put and staying in something longer than I'm maybe comfortable with, right? So we can go in different directions. It's really, I think it plays out uniquely, at least the way I've seen it. I think it plays out uniquely for different people, but those are some examples that I've seen.
So follow on with that. I mean, our audience are almost all business owners at various levels and stages and ages. As we say, we have a broad spectrum audience. If we're interacting with someone else that has their business, and you know, we're doing business together, we like that person, what's some ways our audience can start thinking about, hey, is that other person maybe carrying some grief that I need to try to help them with? Because I already like them. So how can I be helpful and not become a problem?
And I think that's a really interesting point because, so this is going to sound like a tangent, but I'm going to come back to this. I have really, just even with putting pivot chats out into the world and calling it pivot chats, I've rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Some people are like, Livingston, I don't want to hear that word pivot ever again. And I've had it, you know, and a lot of people don't like change. And I know that I do. And so I do feel that while I'm just me and this is the work I do, and it's okay if, you know, I'm not your person, but I think I do pay attention to sort of, I'm more on one end of the continuum with this than many other people. And so I do pay attention to sort of where I am with people, and particularly with a new client or a potential client, like I'm kind of assessing where they are with change so that I can meet them where they are instead of ask them to go into my crazy change planet that they're never going to be comfortable with, and frankly is not really good for them, right? Everybody has their own sort of way of working with change. And so that's sort of the place where I try to read my clients and support them. And so to your point with grief is another topic that I think a lot of people like, please don't, I don't want to talk about it in business, right? I don't have feelings in business, and it depends on what you do, obviously. But I think some of it for me is just almost like sticking that in the back of your brain. And if you're having resistance with a client, particularly if you're trying to help them, a lot of businesses like helping people change, even if it's something they've hired you to do and they really want. It doesn't mean there's not some level of resistance. I know I really want this, but I don't actually really want to let it go and give it to you, or whatever the thing is that is holding them back or that's causing that resistance. And so I think, there's lots of ways, but I think number one is just sort of planting that in the back of your mind and using it as a lens to look at your client situation, especially if you're receiving resistance and it's probably not about you, but B, you're trying to just sort of make sense of it so you can maintain the relationship. Or why won't, we have a great relationship, but when I go to this, they just sort of never reply, never follow up, never do the one, that one thing. There may be nothing to it. They're just busy, but there may be that resistance playing out there because there's a level of grief, or just because the change is something to adjust to. It does take time. So that's kind of, I think that's really important, because not everybody's going to want to talk about it. And I guess it depends on what your work in the world is as to whether that's an appropriate, like I would absolutely talk to my clients about grief. But
I asked that question because James and I both feel it's important to spread as much joy and good energy around as we can. And sometimes in a business context, we may have talked to someone 2 or 3 times and we decide there's some connection, but if they're carrying grief, it's a good thing for us to sort of be aware what things might help with that without, getting too nosy about it. So you've given me some good thoughts on it. Can you tell our audience about pivot chats?
Sure. So pivot chats is I've done this in very much my own sort of experimental way. It's an interview series, soon to be podcast, but I couldn't wait to put the content out in the world. So it's out in the world in video format now. It will go on to podcast platforms this year. I'm making the plan right now. So pivot chats is all about pivoting. Hello. Pivots, transitions. And while some of the pivot chats, and it's both I'm interviewing people who are running businesses and have experienced pivots or transitions. I'm also doing solo episodes about my experience and just talking a little bit about business through the lens of change. But it's not always the obvious big changes. We're absolutely talking about the big, hairy, scary, like one of my clients closed a very successful company because she was just complete with it and really wanted to spend her time in her second business. But so talking about that, sort of those kinds of big changes. But what I'm really enjoying now is it's evolved already, even though we've only got 8 episodes out right now. It's evolved already to be really clear that so much of the work is actually, and so much of the content is actually about the smaller pivots, or I had an internal pivot where I realized I didn't want to do X and I just wanted to do Y. Maybe that's all within my same suite of offers, and all I did was like drop one according to, as far as like externally what other people would see, like might not be a big pivot. I closed this business and started another one kind of thing. But how some of those pivotal decisions or pivotal moments can make or break your joy, your fulfillment in your work. And eventually, for sure, that also affects your ability to impact and work with your clients and serve who you're meant to serve at the greatest level that you can. And so I'm really loving these conversations about, yes, we can talk to hairy, scary, freak people out with a big change. And then also, I really want to normalize that for that existential experience that we have when we're going through those bigger changes, and the grief piece of it and all of that we've talked about today. But also to normalize just the entrepreneurial journey itself and the experience of being, a business owner is a personal growth experience. And what does that really look like? And so that's the other piece of it that's really important to me.
So thank you very much for joining us on this episode. as usual, folks, the links where you can reach Laura are down below in the description. Laura, do you have any final words for the audience?
You know, I'll just say, if you're going through some sort of change, you probably have some sort of, you might be, what you're telling yourself is some version of like, I'm doing it wrong, or why didn't I figure this out sooner? Or, you know, maybe even you're being hard on yourself around something. And then if you just can realize you're going through a change, you can maybe like relax a little bit, or at least give yourself a little space. I think so much of going through change is hard enough, James, to use your point. But when we think we're supposed to go through it differently, it's sort of like an added layer on top of that. And so just a reminder, if you're going through change in your life or your business, where can you, just give yourself a little bit of space, and take a minute with the grief process, take a minute with what you're birthing. Time is just time. And you're definitely not doing it wrong, because there's no wrong way to go through a creative process, and change is a creative process.
All right. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
That was
Appreciate
wonderful.
it.
Thank you.